Agreements with Russians aren't worth the paper they're written on. This phrase is often attributed to Otto von Bismarck. However, I think many of you know that the Chancellor actually never said anything like that. Nevertheless, this wording so accurately reflects, let's say, the essence of Russian diplomacy that the question of its authenticity loses its significance because the phrase itself is true. In the comments under the previous video, I read the opinion that events in the Middle East affect our region so indirectly that paying attention to what is happening there means pushing the Ukrainian tragedy into the background. However, that's not quite true. In reality, depending on how the Iran-Israel conflict unfolds, it could literally bring peace closer for Ukraine as well. I mentioned this partly in my previous video, but now there are some new encouraging developments. Let me explain, referring to a post by someone you know who's been in prison.
Our country's position towards Iran is very unclear. Not so long ago, we signed a strategic partnership agreement with this country. It's hard for me to judge how necessary this was, or how reliable Iran really is as an ally for us, but since the agreement was signed, it's completely unclear why we don't support Iran, at least at the proper military technical level.
In reality, the provisions of the agreement signed between Iran and Russia do not provide for military assistance in the event of aggression against either side. However, one of the points of the strategic partnership agreement states, the parties confirm their commitment to developing military technical cooperation based on the relevant agreements between them, taking into account mutual interests and their international obligations. And they consider such cooperation an important component in maintaining regional and global security. Therefore, the question from the international terrorist, Igor Strelkov, why Russia does not support Iran, is quite reasonable. And indeed, the F-50 stationed off the Iranian coast of the Caspian Sea could theoretically provide serious assistance to Tehran in countering Israeli aviation, since Iran does not have its own long-range radar detection aircraft. By the way, this brings us back to the discussion that it is premature to talk about the need to radically change NATO's military doctrines. Iran is practically a pioneer in the development of strike drones and has an excellent missile industry. However, the lack of such a crucial component as long-range radar reconnaissance aircraft makes Iran's rather large air fleet effectively blind. This is something, by the way, that is underestimated in Ukraine. Not everyone understands what kind of advantage Ukraine gets from various reconnaissance aircraft regularly hovering over the Black Sea, which also can't be shot down. But I have talked about this.
The enemy's aviation continues to prepare for a massive raid on Crimea. The thing is, the aviation of the combined NATO armed forces continues to operate in the western part of the Black Sea. They are assessing the effectiveness of our air defense systems, the use of our electronic warfare equipment, taking bearings and taking photographs. In general, they are carrying out preparatory work so that one day unmanned boats and drones can be launched from here to strike our targets.
Could Moscow, following the example of Ukraine's allies, back up the mullah's regime and send an A-50 to monitor Iranian airspace? Well, theoretically, yes. After Operation Potina, according to open-source intelligence analysts, the Russian aerospace forces have only 2 or 3 operational A-50 long-range radar detection aircraft left. But there's a problem. The issue is the lack of a unified communication system between the Russian airborne warning and control system and the S-300s or Su-35s sold to Iran. So, how do you relay information about a detected Israeli fighter jet to an Iranian Sukhoi pilot? You can't, because such a system isn't really established even in the Russian army.
So, Patriot launches at you, probably 3. Get out. Abort the mission, abort the mission. 754, we're leaving with evasive maneuvers, do you copy? Yes, we're leaving. I see a launch at you. Azimuth from you is 350, distance 80. Move right, heading 240, change your angle. Low altitude, 300 meters. Get out.
Yes, I already let you listen to the radio intercept between the Russian A-50 operator and the Su-34 pilot. As you can see, data transmission is done by voice. But it's one thing to report the approach of a surface-to-air guided missile, and quite another to guide an Iranian fighter onto a detected Israeli F-35. In short, it's impossible. In fact, the fact that the Russian army still hasn't widely implemented an automatic data transmission system isn't really a secret to anyone. Here's what Viktor Murakovsky, a member of the Expert Council under the Military Industrial Commission of the Russian Federation, wrote at the beginning of the year. We have tens of billions of rubles spent on a unified tactical level control system, which is an analog of Link 16 with 0 results. And what else can I say except Lord bless Russian military-industrial complex corruption? But Ukraine recently has gained access to Link 16. That means, theoretically, an F-16 of the Ukrainian Air Force can now receive targeting data from a Boeing E-3 Sentry flying over the Black Sea. Of course, there may be restrictions as always, but in theory that's how it works. So it's understandable why Strokov is upset, but in reality Russia doesn't have the ability to significantly help Iran. I've talked about radar reconnaissance, but even the Russian Federation itself doesn't have enough air defense systems. If Russia is leaving even its gunpowder factories unprotected, then what can Moscow offer Tehran right now besides words of support? Let's read further.
Nevertheless, none of our officials have made any truly strong statements about supporting this country in military technical terms. That's strange to me. I always thought that if some agreements are made on behalf of Russia, then they should at least be fulfilled for the sake of Russia's prestige.
He believed that if Russia signed an agreement, it should abide by it. In my opinion, George Carlin didn't have punchlines that funny, but it's not just funny, it's also very telling. Remember, I told you that it's fundamentally wrong to see the global south as a unified bloc challenging the West, and now we're seeing proof of that. Autocratic regimes lack the most important thing, a unified sense of purpose. Neither Russia nor China nor Iran pursue a single goal. Moscow seeks deglobalization, while Beijing is aiming for the opposite. Tehran is driven by fanatics who have their own view of the world based on ancient illogical tomes. You can't even attribute anti-Americanism to them as a unifying foundation. Right now, Russia is quite satisfied with the White House administration, even suggesting joining forces to fight European fascists. And China, on the contrary, sees Trump as the main threat to its prosperity.
Well, and unfortunately, I don't quite understand China's position. China is Iran's main partner, and China is probably even more interested than Russia in making sure that Iran can withstand the aggression that is being waged against it.
There could be no other reaction from China except to condemn Israel's actions. The explanation is quite simple. Beijing is just as uninterested in Iran acquiring nuclear weapons as Jerusalem is. It was through China's cooperation that diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran were restored. This was a tremendous victory for China. After all, for Beijing, this is not just a region that supplies half of all its oil imports, but also the main customer for infrastructure projects. For China, which strives for global dominance, it is vital to remain the main partner for the monarchies of the Persian Gulf. At the same time, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Oman and others can issue as many written condemnations of Israel's strikes on Iran as they want, but they will never actually oppose them. And some of those who signed the condemnation will even secretly help intercept Iranian drones and missiles launched at Israeli territory. After all these countries understand very well what a threat the Ayatollah regime, armed with nuclear weapons, and their idea of exporting the Islamic Revolution poses to them. For those who don't know, this is one of the main tools of Tehran's foreign policy, to fund and arm terrorist cells throughout the Middle East. So in this situation, if China wants to maintain its partnership with the countries mentioned above, it will never oppose Israel. That's why we won't hear or see anything from official Beijing except condemnation.
Everyone in the Middle East will condemn Israel, and then they'll go home and quietly say, "May Israel be blessed." The Saudis, Bahrainis, Egyptians, Libyans, Lebanese all will say, "Thank God they did it because no one else would have dared." The proposal presented to you today is that you have a choice between war and Iran with a nuclear bomb. As has already been said, it's a choice between war and disgrace. If a country chooses disgrace over war, it will get both war and disgrace. You have a choice: war with a nuclear Iran or war with Iran before it becomes nuclear. And hope that by not allowing this regime to take root, you will give the Iranian people the best chance they will ever have to overthrow this regime. In fact, the United States will get involved against Iran in the near future. I have no doubt about that. Actually, that was implied. Iran has been subjected to a massive air offensive by Israel, which was carefully prepared and by all accounts is a real war, not just an operation.
No, actually, this is an operation, Igor Ivanovich. That's exactly what makes it different from the war that Russia started against Ukraine. Israel has a clear goal: to deprive Iran of the ability to create a nuclear bomb. Does Jerusalem have any legal grounds for this? No. But when a bill appears in the parliament of a country led by religious fanatics, obliging the government to strive to destroy Israel by 2042, then legal norms are hardly a priority. But the main thing is different. Israel does not claim Iranian territories. It does not wish to annex Khuzestan, Lorestan, or any other 8 provinces. Because once Cyrus the Great freed the Jews so that later the Jews could free the Persian Empire. Netanyahu does not demand that Iran abandon its alliance with Russia in favor of an alliance with the United States, does not require the Torah to be studied in schools, and does not wish for Iranians to restore the toppled busts of the Shah everywhere that were removed during the Islamic Revolution. No, the demand is quite clear. Just damn it, don't develop nuclear weapons. So Israel is conducting a special military operation while Putin is waging a war of conquest. But that's just the ethical side of the issue. The most interesting thing is that Igor Ivanovich, who has a pretty good ability to analyze the situation, and I mean that without irony, believes that the United States will soon get involved. He wrote this post a day before reports about it started appearing. And the involvement of the states in the Israeli operation is actually a pretty good sign, friends. If on the first day of the Israeli operation many doubted that the United States would join in the strikes, then after it became clear that the Israeli Air Force had almost completely cleared the skies over Iran, the chances that Donald Trump would want to join in the triumph increased many times over. But could there be any advantages in this for us, opponents of the Putin regime? Well, first of all, the Iranian case. This is the first time during his second term that Trump is not only making promises, but actually starting to solve problems that haven't been resolved for decades. Secondly, seeing the weak reaction from Moscow and Beijing, which is expressed in declarative outrage, the White House may adjust its foreign policy strategy. After all, with Iran, negotiator Witkoff's approaches simply didn't work. But a few hundred air sorties immediately made Tehran more pliable on the nuclear deal issue. And thirdly, if Iran not only loses its nuclear program, but also the political stability of its regime, then Donald will no longer need the Russian dictator as a mediator between Iran and Israel. In fact, as uranium enrichment facilities are destroyed, this need disappears more and more each day. If before there was a chance that Russia would take in the enriched uranium, now this problem has been solved with the help of air bombs. Of course, this is just a hypothesis, and it's by no means certain that events on the Israeli-Iranian front will influence the approach of the American president. But if in a week or two we suddenly see Trump being more decisive toward Putin, don't forget to thank the Israeli pilots.
Overall, of course, Iran won't be able to stand up to the combined power of the United States and Israel unless it receives some serious support. The parameters of this support, I believe, could be very significant, at least at the level of Russia. Since it is Russia that has advanced air defense systems and advanced missile systems with which Iran could, if not respond to Israel, then at least threaten to use this weapon. And perhaps this would have stopped Israel from further aggression and from aggression as such.
In June 1981, the first combat aircraft built with stealth technology took to the skies, the F-117. Since then, debates about the effectiveness of this technology have not subsided. Thanks to incompetent Western journalists, the new F was nicknamed the Invisible, although in reality the aircraft fell into the category of low observability. But Russian propagandists latched onto the term invisible, and after the F-117 was shot down over Yugoslavia, they began to mock the foolish Americans who, for billions of dollars, supposedly got a low observable attack aircraft that was shot down by an old S-125. But in reality, even despite the loss of the aircraft, it was already clear back then that this technology was the future. After all, having completed more than 2,500 combat missions and taking part in all major operations from Desert Storm to the war in Iraq, the F-117 was shot down only once. At the same time, in all these wars, the United States adversaries had fairly powerful air defense systems. However, each time, the stealth aircraft demonstrated their effectiveness. But if the Russian side managed to fool people for decades by claiming that stealth technology is only effective against backward countries, now that question is closed once and for all. Israeli stealth F-35S dominated the skies over Syria, which was protected by Russian S-300 and S-400 systems as early as 2023. And today we have seen with our own eyes that even with such a powerful air defense as Iran's, which purchased at least 4 S-300 PMU, 2 batteries from Russia, they still can't do anything against stealth fighters. Of course, these birds don't operate alone. Here, space reconnaissance is at work, as well as the aforementioned airborne early warning aircraft, of which Israel now has more than Russia. But the fact remains, Western technology is a cut above Russian technology. And I'll say it again, Israel's operation in Iran may not have a United Nations mandate, but the fact that it contributes to peace is absolutely certain. After all, now, the Russian General Staff, which has definitely been developing a plan to invade the Baltic countries for a long time, has to quickly make adjustments to its doctrines and calculate the consequences of encountering such an opponent in the air as European squadrons of 5th-generation aircraft. But of course, this doesn't mean you can relax. So I'll repeat my almost trademarked phrase once again, though slightly modified. Europe, no matter what, you'd still better dig trenches. Although, as always, it's up to you to decide whether to be or